Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much indeed for coming along again this evening. It's good to be in your company, albeit virtually. Tonight's talk has coincided very well, actually, with the release of this book, which I published only a few weeks ago, called A Royal Choir for Wales. And it's ironic, I think, that I spent quite a lot of the lockdown period, fortunately, having a project like this to do, because I think we all, in some degree, realise the effect on our mental health that lockdown has. But it gave me a wonderful opportunity as well to find years of research, which I'd kind of not really done an awful lot with for a long time, and also listen to some great sort of choral music while I was penning the book, which was ironic, of course, because I ended up publishing a book about singing at a time when nobody can. And the fact that the voices of these great singers in the valleys have been silenced over the last year or more, I thought was ironic that I ended up writing a book about choral singing. But the fact of the matter is, I've always had a great interest in choirs, and particularly in the choral heritage of Wales. Now, this wonderful image we have of Wales as the land of song, it's a beautifully romantic image, it may be, but the question is, are we all great singers? Well, not everyone in Wales can sing, clearly. Those who are blessed with a good voice will probably put it down to the cold spring-like water or the warm frothy beer. Probably too much of the latter makes them all think they're great singers, even if they're not. But in all honesty, when you consider how small a country we are, how limited a population that we've actually got, we managed to fight well above our weight when it comes to producing great talent. Even back in the 12th century, Gerald of Wales, on his travels around the Principality, stated that the Welsh sing prettily in many parts. So maybe even then we had some sort of wonderful connection with harmonious singing. But in all honesty, today, even after the passing of so many years, we are still producing great singers, and we are still very much at the forefront of the music world. Just look at the world of opera, for instance, in the last 50 or 60 years. Everyone from Stuart Burroughs and Sir Geraint Evans up to Sir Bryn. Think of popular music and easy listening. Well, you can have your Shakin' Stevens and your Bonnie Tyler compared to your Shirley Bassey and your Tom Jones. And then even in the world, of course, of rock music, you've got global artists like the likes of the Stereophonics and the Manic Street Preachers. So there must be something about the Welsh and about the way we've embraced singing, and it's become very much part of our culture, and I think part of our national identity as well. In all honesty, the land of song owes that image to a very important period in Welsh history, where we united as a communities, and we began to raise our voices in choral singing. Now, another reason I've been interested in this particular story is because I spent 30 years of my life as a chorister with a male voice choir, which I stepped away from a few years ago, only because of work conditions and because of illness in the family. But I'm always afraid these days to ever name this choir, because whenever I go in Wales, there's always a choir in that particular town or village, and people get rather parochial about what their choir is. So I've got to a stage now, I don't tell anyone which one I was in. But the only thing I'll tell you was it started with the letter T and ended with Rioki, and that's all I'm telling you. But in all honesty, the reason I mention that is because Treorchy is connected to the story I'm going to give you this evening about male voice and congregational groups, as well as choral societies. Because there's a lot of shadow of a doubt, we owe this working class music making to the industrial heritage of Wales, and in particular the South. Denigrating the North and saying that North Wales hasn't produced any great singers or choirs, that isn't the truth. But certainly South Wales, predominantly in those industrial valleys, those coal mining and ironwork valleys, has produced a plethora of choral ensembles over the last 150 years. And it's to them, really, I've got to bow my head and speak about this particular period in Welsh cultural history. If I'm going to talk about Treorchy as one of the choirs I'll talk about later, which is just really symbolic of all of the choirs in Wales, then I want to talk about an area which again is very much symbolic of the Wales coalfield, and way better really than the Rhondda, as being the largest producer of steam coal. Now let's just look at the Rhondda and how it looked before the coming of heavy industry. Lush green farmlands, a very agricultural landscape spreading across two valleys, the large and the small, the Fach and the Fawr, with scattered homesteads and about 950 people living there. They had 3 places of work, and in actual fact, singing wasn't a major part of Sunday services until the middle part of the 19th century. It wasn't even up until that point, if there had been any congregational singing, any hymnals that would have been sung, they would probably be done in unison, if anything else. There was no pipe organs, and there may have been upright piano if they were lucky. But in all honesty, singing wasn't a huge part of worship. Once the revivals came from West Wales, and particularly then singing, of course, and particularly hymns by people like Pontypridd, became a major part, again, of Sunday worship. But up until this point, it wasn't such a big part of it. And you have about 950 people living in these two valleys, attending one of the chapels or the one Anglican church. And of course, things would change dramatically with the sinking of the first deep colliery in the 1850s. Once the Bute Company sank that deep shaft at Cwm Brent Farm in Treherbert, then of course, that would change the forever. It would now be transformed into some sort of vast black Klondike, really, as the magnitude of collieries that were sunk, the way in which villages and towns were erupted, really, and of course the mass migration of people was extraordinary. We're talking a population boom of 950 people in 1851 to 170,000 by 1920. We're talking about the creation of 36 villages and towns within a decade and a half. We're also talking about the sinking of 73 working collieries within that area. Now, this kind of population boom had never been experienced by us before to this degree. And of course, it brought people from very different walks of life, very different backgrounds, geographically, culturally, religiously, some from the southwest of England, for instance, Cornwall, Devon, then of course Southern Ireland, as well as West Wales, Mid Wales, all coming together in these narrow and particularly dark valleys, what must have created a volatile melting pot, really, of new communities. And they all came with these traditions and with his musical heritage too. It must have been an incredibly exciting place to have lived. But let's no doubt about this. We've spent, I think, as well, a little bit too much time romanticizing about a history of industry, which really and truly looked nothing like Maureen O'Hara told you about in How Green Is My Valley. And the fact of the matter was there was a huge price to pay for coal. And I don't mean monetary value. I mean the fact that people suffered greatly. You know, we've got to realize that I think the facts and figures behind the coal industry of this period is really the reason that ignited people's interest in coming together and singing in congregations. I'll tell you why that is. Can you imagine in those first 50 years of the coal industry in the Rhondda that 900 men would lose their lives underground? In fact, the life expectancy of a man was little over 48. Just at explosions and accidents underground, we're also talking about long-term health problems, dust on the lung, pneumoconiosis. Children, for instance, 1 in every 5 child dead before its first birthday in 1860, that high infant mortality rate. You know, the Victorian Welsh recognise death on a daily basis. And historians as well, I think, have neglected to concentrate on the sacrifices of the women too. There are peaks you see in social history in Wales where death certificates will show premature death amongst women at times of industrial strife, at times of strike, because of course when the coal was being sold at a particularly good rate, that was reflected very well in the wage packet of the miner. But that sliding scale of wages compared to coal prices would mean that there were times, of course, when families went without. And at times of strike, they certainly went without altogether. And it's often the case that it was the woman who may have died because of exhaustion, or dare I say it, malnutrition, for ensuring that her husband and children were fed before herself. So that creates a bit of a darker kind of picture of what life would have been like in the valleys. Not all the times, of course, but it's certainly in places like the Rhondda, what it also did. And I suppose the pandemic in the last year has shown that it's still within us as a human race, that at times of strife and problems, we can still come together. And these were certainly communities that did just that. People romanticize now about the strong-knit communities of the South Wales valleys, and there's no doubt that it was true, because people faced hardship together, and that brought them together. But not just in times of hardship, they came together at times of celebration too, of course. But where was the one place they could gather on a regular basis and form these relationships with their neighbours, with new friends, with people in the same village or town? Where was the one place they would congregate on a frequent basis, not just once a week, but maybe several times a week? And where was it they first began to sing as a congregation? Well, of course, it was those non-conformist chapels. Non-conformity was such a strong religious force in working class Wales, particularly during the second half of the Victorian era. And the Rhondda was a typical example of that too. Of those 36 communities, there were 153 non-conformist chapels. These weren't just places of public worship either. These were places of entertainment, of knowledge, the Sunday school system, the fact that that enhanced the Welsh language. It also embraced cultural life, the brass band movement, the choir. The Sunday school system offered education. It was also a place, of course, of great political debate. People got their first taste of socialism, maybe, by seeing one of these great kind of left-wing socialists in the pulpit, telling them of the rights of the working man and woman. These chapels were a haven of entertainment and also a place where people who performed. We all have memories, I'm sure, of what Easter and Christmas would have been like, with the sounds of the Elijah and the Messiah every year. These are also places of things like the penny readings and Band of Hope, and all manner of entertainment would be found in these cultural community hubs. It was also here that people began to combine and sing. Once singing became part of public worship, you also saw the creation of many of the mixed choirs, the great kind of choral societies of which these chapels became renowned. And I think, looking back at those figures I told you about earlier, I think these were a people that recognized very early on that singing together as a group, performing, rehearsing, letting off steam really by singing together was good for their well-being. It relieved them of the stresses and anxieties they may have been going through. You know, in today's age, it's a medical fact that singing, particularly choral singing in a group, is good for you. Otherwise, there would not be such a huge surge in choirs, such as the 10 of us choirs, for instance, with those suffering with cancer. It's beneficial to your general health and well-being. Well, I've got to say it, our forefathers knew this 150 years ago. And I think that was a big part of why these choirs were being formed. There was also the fact, of course, that people felt as if they were getting closer to God as part of worship. It was inspiring. There was a form of escapism about it too. They were forgetting about the woes of the day. Anyone who sings amongst the group we're here tonight, I'm sure you'll agree, after a good rehearsal of a really good sing, you feel a lot better for it as well. I think all of those things mixed together was a real pivotal point in bringing congregations like this to become choral ensembles. But the question is, of course, how on earth could you possibly teach a working class movement like this at a time when the greater majority of the population couldn't even spell their own name? So how can you teach them the intricacies of musical notation, of staff notation like the treble clef and the bass clef, of minims, crotchets, quavers, and everything else that goes along with it, the sheer intricacies of musical notation? Well, luckily for us, of course, there was an Italian monk who really devised it as far back as the medieval period, but it took an English one called John Kerwin to actually patent it. And what he created was a very simple form of musical notation, concentrating on just 8 letters, which regardless of the change of key would always stick. They were, of course, and you may have seen the modulators hanging in your own schoolrooms as children. We are talking, of course, about tonic sol fa, do re mi fa sol la ti do. If you're still looking slightly quizzed at what I'm talking about, then I think the best lesson I can ever give someone about do re mi fa sol la ti do is on a Christmas afternoon, probably on BBC Two, where the chances are there'll be a nun on a mountain top in Austria with 7 children, and she'll be telling them all about it in song. It's such an easy way of learning music. And of course, the working classes embraced it wholeheartedly. What's lovely about this period is not only is there the coming now of tonic sol fa, but also, of course, there's the coming of railway transport for passengers. The creation of choirs, of mixed choral societies, by the 1860s became very strong in South Wales, and they could also move around. At a time, of course, when the other great impetus would bring them together, and that was the dawning of the Eisteddfod movement again, the first national Eisteddfod in Aberdeen in 1861. All of these things come into the mix. It's no wonder we started to become renowned as a musical nation. It would take an Italian journalist at the time to say, Wales is just like Italy in the rain. More to do with our love of operettas, I think, than anything to do with our fine cuisine or red wine. All this was coming together at the same period, and it would create kind of a climax of a feeling, really, because of course now people were loving the opportunity of singing, and there's that image we have of a Victorian family together at the parlour on a Sunday singing around the upright piano. You know, people were learning operettas and ballads, folk tunes and spirituals, and of course the growth of the great Welsh hymn book. And they were learning it through tonic sol fa predominantly too. It brought families together, it was bringing congregations together, it was bringing communities together. The growth of tonic sol fa was to such an extent there'd be degrees in it. There'd be colleges to tonic sol fa as well. It became that popular and that easier notation. And then it became a published piece of music that people could buy. It wasn't just sheet music for the piano now, you could also buy tonic sol fa versions. And it was a Welsh printer who also was a composer and a hymn writer himself, Gwlad, who had a printing company in Merthyr Tydfil and one up in Wrexham. And he thought about publishing a magazine filled with Welsh music and folk songs, as well as operatic arias. And it'd be staff notation and tonic sol fa side by side. He called the magazine a Cerddor Cymraeg, the Welsh musician. And in fact, his investors laughed at him when he first brought the idea out in 1860. But when he brought out Cerddor Cymraeg and it sold 20,000 copies in the first week, they kind of stopped laughing. And then 65,000 copies were being sold the second week, and he was on to a winner. He had managed to realise, and he put his finger on the pulse really of what was happening in Wales at the time, that we really were becoming a nation known for more than just industry, that there was a unique culture there as well. At a time, of course, when we as a nation were feeling pretty inferior about ourselves. The loss of the Welsh language, as well as administrative rights of the language too. The idea that our Welsh culture, history, literature was almost neglected, and we were being absorbed by an empire that saw no part of us for us to play, except for the steam coal we were providing the Navy. But it would come to a climax in 1871. And that was really very much down to this man. This is Griffith Jones. He was a blacksmith. He came from Trycynnon, near Aberdeen. He was known as Caradog by his bardic name. He'd been quite a prolific adjudicator and conductor. As a young man, he had a very promising children's choir in Aberdeen. He also apparently conducted his grandfather's choir to a winning prize when he was only 10 years of age. He was a great character. He was a big, larger-than-life kind of man, I think. And he was incredibly stubborn, as well as really hot-tempered. I would say very much like many a conductor I've sung under myself over the years. He was an archetypal Welsh conductor of the period. And along with the support of several businessmen really, he recognised there was an opportunity to really fly the Welsh flag for its people. And that was because the Crystal Palace Company in London were going to hold a music festival. They were inviting mixed choirs from across Europe to come to London and compete at Crystal Palace in the July of 1872. The prize was £1,000 and some rather attractive trophies too, to boot. And Caradog had the idea that he would bring together a choral society, involving choristers from across South Wales, and he would take them to Crystal Palace. He called them the South Wales Choral Union. They became far better known as Cor Mawr Caradog. And of course, he's remembered today for this amazing opportunity by having a statue to himself, of course, in Victoria Square in Aberdeen. Caradog basically brought choristers from across South Wales, from Swansea and Neath, from Pontypridd and the Rhondda, from Merthyr, Aberdeen, even down in Cardiff. He rehearsed them independently. He brought them together for one concert in Cardiff. They got on the train, headed to London. And when they got to Crystal Palace, and this enormous audience awaited them, things went slightly wrong, it must be said. On the one hand, it appeared they took 40 minutes to get on stage because they began to argue who should be in the front row. And then when they did finally get into place, they went slightly out of tune, and then also totally out of the same speed. The timing was all wrong. They were a half a bar ahead because they'd been used to rehearsing with the piano. When they got there was a 32-piece string orchestra awaiting their arrival. They'd never experienced this before. Caradog, it was said, got very annoyed, threw his baton, shouted something rather unkind to the sopranos, and basically said, just listen to the band, which greatly upset the orchestra players, of course, who didn't consider themselves as common as bandsmen. Well, they finally pulled themselves together, and indeed, they won. On winning that first prize, and the fact the National Committee of the South Wales Choral Union presented them with rather a magnificent trophy to remember the victory by, they also, of course, introduced a rather special moment in Welsh history, because this choir of Caradogs was the first group of Welsh people to compete on behalf of the nation in a foreign land. So let me explain. Before there was a Welsh Rugby Union and a Welsh Rugby team, or a Football Association of Wales, it was a choir that got together as a team then and performed on behalf of Wales over the border. He started a piece of history here, and he was determined to go back the second year and win again. And lo and behold, the following year, he had more support. Choristers from North West and East Wales would join. They rehearsed more frequently as an entire group. He also had the support of the Welsh gold miners in South Africa, who had a solid gold baton made for him. James Howells, in his department store in Cardiff, had a wonderfully embroidered Welsh flag. Even Richard Crawshay, the Iron King in Merthyr, in Cyfarthfa there, ensured they rehearsed with the Cyfarthfa Orchestra, just so they didn't go to tune a second time. And indeed, they won a second time too. On this occasion, they returned to South Wales to a victory celebration. By now, Caradog had left Aberdeen and he'd gone to live in Treorchy. In fact, he was the landlord of the Treorchy Hotel because he'd become the founding director of the Rhondda Brewery Company. Much to their surprise, when they returned to the valleys, there was wonderful bunting like this to be found on the streets, in the shop windows. He led them to victory. He sounds more like a returning Roman gladiator than a Welsh conductor. He got to the train station of Ystrad in the Rhondda to visualise what he said was a sea of upturned faces, about 5,000 people waiting for him at the platform and in the adjoining streets. They carried him shoulder high in his bardic chair, through the valley, up to Treorchy, sat him in the middle of Stag Square, the main square of the town, where at 2 o'clock in the morning he gave them an impromptu performance of March of the Men of Harlech, stood on top of the chair and announced to this mass congregation of celebratory people, Gwlad y Gan yw Gymru gyd, he said, all Wales is a land of song. If ever there was a wonderful turn of phrase, and I hope he invented it, then of course this would stick. Until now, the Welsh really had been considered somewhat classless, without any real culture. And now we were being recognised that we had an art, a quality to our music, an understanding of magnificent compositions. Don't forget, they had to rehearse 8 large classical choral pieces, Mendelssohn, Beethoven, Bach, Wagner, and they would have to choose 3 to perform at the competition. This was no mean feat. People's perceptions of Wales and its culture were beginning to change, and this land of song was becoming stronger than ever. And I suppose if there's one element that continued throughout that era and into the present era, even though the mixed choirs and the female choirs and the children's choirs all play their role, it's really the fact of the matter is the male voice choir has become very symbolic of Welsh working class music making. But there's a difference here. Male voice choir singing became much more popular from the 1870s onwards in Wales, because the mixed choirs, as I said, had started their life in chapel, whereas the male voice choir, of course, had found their voice in somewhere entirely differently. That was in the pub. Now, the idea being that miners sang underground while working those shifts, they sang in the pub after work, they sang in chapel on a Sunday. It's very true. I'm not saying that every poor miner, after 12 hours in the bowels of the earth, would come up in that rattling cage to the surface to walk out probably in darkness as he'd gone down there, and then would walk home several miles singing Caron Lan all the way. I'm sure he was too exhausted for that. But without a shadow of a doubt, singing became very much part of their culture like everybody else. But the difference with men is they're a competitive lot. Rugby hadn't been invented. Football was a very upper middle class public schoolboy kind of game. So the only real competitive sport that young men had were things like horse racing, foot racing, cards, Knappen and Bando, a very irregular, unruly kind of ball games in Glamorganshire. But once the Eisteddfod movement grew and singing became competitive, they kind of embraced it. And don't forget, these early pioneers really in valleys like the Rhondda were largely young men. Women and their children certainly wouldn't have moved with them to a community where they didn't have a house or a roof over their heads. It was these men who would build these communities. They would create these reading rooms and billiard halls and chapels and workingmen's clubs and schools and shops and all those monotonous streets of terrace houses. And it was those young men who would love to compete. And this is when a lovely period comes in Welsh history, where it wasn't just about honour. It wasn't just about the fact that if they won, they were competing on behalf of a chapel or a village or a colliery maybe. There was also money at stake. It wasn't trophies, it was cash prizes. And these choristers could win a bit of money on the side if they were fortunate and if they were well prepared, of course. And it was very much typical of the period, especially from the 1870s onwards, for choirs to basically get together with several weeks' notice, rehearse test pieces, go to the local Eisteddfod, perform, and if they won, they'd probably go straight to the pub and enjoy every single penny of it. And then would disband just as quickly, only to recommence again maybe as a different choir for another Eisteddfod several months down the road. If you look at newspapers of the period, you'll see the quantity and quality of choirs and competitions of the period is extraordinary. Newspapers like the Pontypridd Observer, Rhondda Leader, Aberdare Leader will devote pages and pages just to the adjudicators and what they have to say about Eisteddfod. And this is a lovely time, I think, with these men. They wanted to compete. They wanted to win money. They gambled behind the scenes. And of course, there's an element as well of real competitiveness that spills over into a little bit of hooliganism too, it must be said. Because there was a bit of fighting going on. There were a few bloody noses in the marquee of the Eisteddfod. The constabulary were called into many an Eisteddfod at the time. It was a rough and ready kind of period too. There's a couple of lovely stories, I've got to say. Some of adjudicators frightened for their lives to give the prizes to a choir that didn't come from the town where the Eisteddfod was being held because they thought there'd be ructions afterwards. Some saying they'd even escaped to the train station dressed as policemen in case they were assaulted on the way. There's also tales of choirs being on stage and their rivals would be in the audience and they'd pull out their clay pipes and start smoking and blowing the tobacco into their faces. So they'd cough halfway through and then, of course, hopefully lose the prize. Or one stage further, one choir had been on stage in a marquee where the rivals went round the back, pulled out all the pegs and the entire building collapsed on top of them halfway through the competition. We knew of it in Wales as Cythrail y Canu, the demon or the devil in music. It's the intense rivalry that existed then between these choirs, and it's obvious why. Okay, there's a sense of rivalry today, but it's nothing compared to what it would have been then. And there was great money to be had at stake, not just pride and dignity. And it's this kind of backdrop that saw the emergence of male choirs like the one in Treorchy. Now, this choir began in the summer of 1883, as a very small unit of about 18 men, all aged under 25, who were colliers in one of the collieries in Cwm Park near Treorchy, the park and the day collieries. And they got together in the pub on a Friday night. One of their fellow workmates was emigrating to New Zealand, so the chances are they would never see him again. And they decided to give him a farewell party. They unfortunately ran out of money, apparently, and wondering where they could get the rest of their beer money from, were informed that there was an Eisteddfod being held upstairs in the main concert hall above the bar in the Red Cow public house on the main street there in Treorchy. So they quickly got together in the bar. One of their own was an organist in the local chapel called George Thomas, George Bach he was known as. Nothing to do with any association with a German composer, more to do with the fact he's about 5 foot nothing like myself. And he whipped them into shape in the bar, it was said, and he chose a piece for them to sing in the Eisteddfod. He chose this new love song that was becoming very popular at the time, written by Dr. Joseph Parry. I'm sure you've never heard of it. It was called, oh, I don't know, Myfanwy or something. Anyway, they went upstairs, sang Myfanwy, won £1 for their efforts, and they began to realize maybe they should stick together this time. And they began to rehearse as a small group, sometimes in the pub, in good weather, out on the street, on the mountainside even. In 1885, they competed at a Whitsun Eisteddfod in St. Fagans on the Adolf Adams test piece, a real war horse of a male voice choir piece called Comrades in Arms. And they won £25 at that competition. We're talking big money here. They knew they had to have a new conductor, someone who could give them his time and expertise. And luckily that man was found in Treorchy. He was called William Thomas. He came from Mountain Ash. He'd been a well-known chorus master there, had been appointed chorus master of Untitled Chapel in Treorchy. He was the director of the local cooperative society, but he was hated by every child in the vicinity because he was the school attendance officer for the parish, the whipper-in. When he was given the chance to conduct this young fledgling choir, he accepted, but there was one rule. He informed them he was teetotal and they would never rehearse in the pub again. They'd have to move to the school. It caused ructions, as you can imagine, amongst this group of men, demanding that they couldn't possibly have a rehearsal without some good ale to lubricate the larynx. He was having none of it. It was either his way or no way at all. And of course, they ended up giving in. It was a good thing they did. He claimed the first prize at the National Eisteddfod in 1888 in Brecon, the first time for the Blue Ribbon to come to the Rhondda for a male voice choir competition. Categories were becoming fearful as well. People were competing more regularly by now. And in fact, congregations and support for these choirs was immense. It became like tribal warfare, to be honest with you. I'll give you a little indication how popular the male voice choir category had become in the National Eisteddfod. By 1891, Wales played England in rugby. And don't forget, there was plenty of train transport at the time. And 8,000 people got to the game. The game was in Newport that year, by the way. So 8,000 people went to see the rugby match, the international between Wales and England, and it was a good turnout. The same year at the National Eisteddfod, the male voice choir competition, dubbed the Battle of the Giants, brought over 20,000 people to see the competition. That's how popular choral competitions were compared to this Welsh religion of sport. William Thomas and his Treorchy Male Society, as they were known, had a rival. Unfortunately for them, their rival was based only 2 miles down the road in the village of Pentre. They were called the Rhondda Glee Society. And their conductor, Tom Stevens, had quite a bit in common with William Thomas. He was also from the Aberdare area. And like William Thomas, they both sung in Caradog's choir in Crystal Palace as young men. The difference was William Thomas was the firm teetotal, and Tom Stevens, well, he was a pub landlord. He had the Blacksmith's Arms in Treherbert. They competed against each other 11 times. Treorchy would win 6 times, the Rhondda Glee would win 3 times, and on 2 occasions, the adjudicators basically split the prize money and said, we don't want any fighting here today. You both performed as well as each other. A little bit of cowardice there, I think. On one occasion, the Rhondda Glee Society got to perform in the Chicago World Fair, beating 23 other choirs. They came back bankrupt, but they had one heck of a trip out of it. The competitions would continue over the years until 1895 was the pivotal moment. The National Eisteddfod at Llanelli, the male voice choir competition, drew a huge crowd, and these two choirs were head-to-head. Treorchy would win, and to celebrate this success, the choristers, who were now over 80 of them, decided to celebrate on the sands of Mumbles Beach the following day. They had the afternoon on the beach, sitting there singing impromptu verses to the walkers by on the promenade. And one of those who was travelling down the promenade in an open-top carriage that day was the Countess of Dunraven. She listened to the singing, was quite enamoured by the quality of their performance, and invited the choir to perform at a banquet in her conservatory at Dunraven Castle, which of course stood amongst the cliffs of Southerndown near Bridgend. They accepted. They went along several times that summer to perform at Dunraven Castle for the Count and for Lord and Lady Dunraven. And behind the scenes, a little bit of string pulling had started, because thanks to them, they were able to get a royal audience. A telegram would arrive at William Thomas's door. The Queen has decided to hear Welsh choir and to contact Sir Edward Clinton for more information. This was a huge moment. Queen Victoria had never commanded a royal concert by a Welsh choir before. So this wasn't just about Treorchy or the Rhondda, this was an honour for the whole of Wales. You can imagine the men of this choir were overjoyed at the opportunity. Tom Stevens, however, and the rival Rhondda Glee Society were furious. In fact, Tom Stevens went so far as to try and get the postmaster in Treorchy sacked, because he said he'd given the telegram to the wrong choir and it should be us that goes to Windsor. Well, people were going to listen to poor Tom Stevens, and indeed, it was the Treorchy Male Society that got there. On November the 29th, 1895, they sang at St. George's Hall in Windsor Castle. 60 people were in the audience, mostly members of the family and the household, and Queen Victoria emerged on the arm of her Indian attendant, Abdul. She said what wonderful voices they have, asked if they were all minors, asked for several encores as well, which was unheard of apparently in a royal concert. And they were bestowed with great honour from the royal family. The Western Mail the following day had this beautiful headline that said, "They behaved like gentlemen and sang like angels." William Thomas returned to Wales as a national hero, as did the men of his choir. And in fact, that royal seal of approval was very much cemented only a few weeks later, when a bejewelled baton appeared. It was designed by the Queen's jewellers in honour of the concert, an ebony baton with a VR insignia, and it was bejewelled with diamonds and rubies and sapphires, a magnificent piece. By the way, Tom Stevens and his Rhondda Glee Society, I should tell you, did get to Windsor eventually. It took him another 3 years. William Gladstone pulled the strings for them. I think they kind of contacted him so much he was glad to get them off his back, I think, in the end. And he organised the concert, again at St. George's Hall, but the Queen did not require any encores. The audience, it said, wasn't as appreciative, and all poor Tom Stevens had was a tie pin for his efforts. One journalist who was there for both concerts said it was obvious why this was a difference between the two choirs. The Treorchy men had appeared in their Sunday best. They were treated like minors, like amateur singers, and they won the hearts of the royal family. Whereas the Rhondda Glee Society appeared wearing white gloves, and they were considered professional. Lovely story, at least. But William Thomas had a problem on his hands. This Treorchy Male Society of his was now a superstar of a celebrity kind of group. We're talking about summer seasons, tours around Britain, Ireland, Scotland, in fact, overseas tours as well. He couldn't possibly take 80 men out of the pit, out of work, take them from their families. They couldn't afford to put tours on of that magnitude. So what he did was slim down his choir. He handpicked 25 of his best voices, although they did also include 4 of his sons, admittedly. And he formed a new male voice choir called the Royal Welsh Choir of Treorchy. And this choir would go to sing for another 100 years, and successfully were at it too. They were a semi-professional group of male singers. They would sing on countless overseas tours. at the launch of the Queen Mary. They'd sing for every monarch in Britain in the 20th century, almost every prime minister, and even sang on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1965. They only disbanded in the 1990s. What I love about one of their first tours was this. The 08-09, they went for 2 years. They gave 560 concerts. South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States of America. They'd sing for Teddy Roosevelt in the White House. And I love the story that when they were going across the plains of Nebraska in the Midwest, the governor of Nebraska had written to them ahead of the tour and invited them to sing on a Native American reservation. He said that the Native Americans had never heard a choir from Britain before, and would they come and perform? And he did exactly that. And one of the choristers, following the concert on the reservation, told his fellow singers he wasn't continuing on the trip. Short time in the reservation, he'd fallen madly in love with the daughter of the chief of the tribe, and he wasn't willing to leave her behind. The choristers were aghast because he really did stay behind. He lived there for 25 years on the reservation with her. They were shocked to leave him, although I have to say, not half as shocked as his wife and 5 children back home in Treorchy at the time. The Royal Welsh certainly were quite a choir in their own right. And I think this was the starting point too of a new golden era of choral singing in Wales. Because come the 1920s, we have a period now where the national strike in particular and the drop in the price of coal, the emerging poverty in the South Wales coalfield. People were out of work. They either had time on their hands and were looking for things to do, or they wanted to try and raise money, particularly those who were hungry because of the strike. You know, the famous 6 Welsh tenors, for instance, went across America in 1927 to 28, 29, raising money for the striking colliers back home. And it's at this period you get the start of a number of large male voice choirs that dominated the National Eisteddfod arena over the next 40 years. The first of them would be created by a group of miners out of work, also in the Rhondda, but in the smaller of the 2 valleys, the Rhondda Fach, near Tylerstown. They looked to form a choir. They named it after the local railway signal box. And in 1924, the Penderys Male Choir was born. A decade later, and a group of choristers in the Morriston United Choir in the Swansea Valley have a big falling out because the conductor is not happy when he hears the news that they drink the night before they go to chapel on a Sunday morning. And this split occurs in the choir, and so a new choir is formed in 1935 to be called, of course, the Morriston Orpheus Male Choir. In Dorky, what was left over of William Thomas's original choir that didn't join the Royal Welsh, they continued singing in their own right up until the 1920s, 30s and 40s, but then disbanded during the Second World War. And in 1946, on October the 16th, a new Treorchy and district male choir was formed, what is now the present day Treorchy Male Voice Choir. What's I think important about this period is these 3 choirs, although there's many other male voice choirs in Wales, and I have a great affiliation with many of them as a compare of concerts. So whether it's Cor Maib in Pontypridd, in Pontypridd hometown, whether it's Cwm Bach or Llanelli, Dunfant, Beaufort, Dowlais, Caldicot, you name them, Rhoscanech Grigog, there's plenty to name. At this particular period, 3 Welsh choirs dominated the national arena more than anyone else. Penderys through the 20s and 30s, Morriston through the 30s and 40s, and Treorchy through the 50s and 60s. They'd become household names. They'd have record contracts. They'd perform with international celebrities. What was incredible about them, I think, is they were under the conductorship of these 3 men. And you know what? These 3 conductors, they were incredible individuals, but not one of them had a single musical qualification to their name. Arthur Duggan of Penderys worked in the co-op, selling insurance door to door. Ivor Sims of Morriston, part-time, he was a head teacher. John Hayden Davis in Treorchy was a headmaster of a primary school in Treherbert. Yet all of them were great leaders of these singers. They formed magnificent choirs, and they led them on golden realms, really, of competition success. I want to finish off by telling you really quickly about my sort of period with Treorchy, because it makes me smile to think that I was so lucky to be involved in a choir that did take me around the world and got to meet some incredible people. But I was doing it a century after our original choir had done it, and they were going on sailboats, steamboats, trains across wildernesses. We were like a jet-set chorister compared to what our forefathers, and that was an incredible feeling, really. You know, on 3 occasions we got to perform tours of Australia, month-long tours, and New Zealand too, performing to sell-out concert halls, the largest concert halls in the countries, in Perth, Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide, Canberra, over to Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland. This is an amateur choir at the end of the day, as so many of them are. And here we are packing out the Sydney Opera House. We're the first Welsh choir to ever sing there, by the way. And the atmosphere there was incredible, electric, I'd say. People wearing Welsh rugby jerseys, 3,000 people packing the auditorium. You know, blow up dolls of sheep blown about the room, blow up daffodils, people waving Welsh flags. Grown men in the front row crying their eyes out as soon as we start singing We'll Keep a Welcome in the Hillsides. We were 10,000 miles from home. It made us upset too, I can assure you. I was very lucky that night in our first concert there in 1999, because I was the soloist for the choir for over 20 years. And one song I sang frequently was called Unwaith eto yng Nghymru Annwyl, One More Time, My Beloved Wales. It's a lovely song of the Welsh exiles, pulls at the old heartstrings and says how wonderful Wales is, you know. And I got to sing at the end of the first half, and it's a wonderful piece. The choir comes in as a huge voice at the end of the second verse, and the chorus is magnificent. And it brought the house down, and the applause was terrific, not for myself, but for the whole, you know, ensemble. And I walked off stage elated by what had just happened. And there was a technical crew on the side of the stage holding a landline telephone out onto the stage. So I walked over to them and I said, mind me asking, who's on the end of this telephone? And he said, well, we've got to tell you, mate. He said, your mother and father back home in Llantrisant are on the end of the line. We had to make sure they got to hear their boy in the Sydney Opera House. And I thought, I'm glad they've told me now after I've done it, rather than before I started. We got to tour a lot in the 90s and in the 2000s. When we got to America on one of the tours, we went to Carmel, where one of the members of the audience was the Oscar-winning Hollywood actress Joan Fontaine. And we had dinner afterwards, after the concert, and we became friends for 20 years, her and I. And she was quite a reclusive woman who now was no longer in the film industry. But I was very lucky, and it was only because I'd been a member of a choir that I got to meet her and spend a lot of time with her, taking my parents out to meet her as well. She died a few years ago at 97 and left a wealth of great films and also some lovely memories for those Welshmen who sang for her that night, because she was absolutely glorious to be with. We got to sing, of course, with people like Ella Fitzgerald, Julie Andrews, Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey, and also on the Royal Variety Show, where I was very fortunate to meet Her Majesty the Queen as part of the royal lineup. And I've got to say that in the last few years as well, the Prince Albert II of Monaco holds St. David's Day dinners at the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo. And for 3 consecutive years, we went out and sang at the St. David's Day dinner with Shirley Bassey. And Prince Albert is a huge Welsh rugby supporter. He will fly over and watch games over here, as well as go to Murrayfield and Lansdowne Road and Twickenham. And he knows every word of Sosban Fach as well, and always wears this wonderful Welsh flag of a tie, which you'll see there in the front row. You know, as things go on and this whole kind of land of song tradition develops and changes, and people are always concerned that is there a future for land song? Well, I think there's certainly a future for many of these choirs that have emerged, particularly these younger choirs who maybe aren't such an institution, because to be a member of a male voice choir or a women's choir or a mixed choir requires so much dedication. Maybe 2 rehearsals a week and concerts the length and breadth of the UK on weekends is too much for some groups, particularly as this generation of choristers gets older as well. But there's certainly a vibrancy in some of the younger choirs you see, maybe aren't quite so professional as far as performing so regularly and rehearsing so regularly. And they still seem to win a lot of choristers. And it's a great thing to see. long may this tradition continue, because it's such a wealth of culture and such a hugely important part for people's lives. And choral singing is very much in my blood, I must say. And I've enjoyed every minute of singing, of writing this book, and I've got to say, of speaking to you as well this evening, because Dylan Thomas very nicely said that we were a musical nation, and to thank the Lord for that. And well, long may that continue, isn't it? Ladies and gents, thanks very much for listening. It's very kind of you.